So I've started the live stream, and this one's going to be about models. It's going to be about Wardley mapping, and, well, surprise, yeah. And I think it's also going to be about the category of thing that Wardley mapping belongs to. And I posed a question on Twitter the other day, two questions. One about modeling, like what do models do? Trying to find some language to describe what models do for us. And then the other thing that I asked about is, like, what is the category of things that Wardley mapping, Cynefin, or like the ideal present framework, what is the category that those things belong to? And there's a reason that I'm asking this question. It's not just idle curiosity or clickbait or what have you. It's actually about solving a problem, and I think maybe it makes sense to describe the problem, maybe do a little bit of context setting, then describe the problem, maybe with a value chain or a Wardley map. We'll see how far we get. And then see if we can actually like synthesize some of the data that we have now, the information that we have about that problem. So first, I'm just going to pull open good old Twitter here. Let's find my tweets. There were two tweets. One was a tweet about models, and the other was a tweet about Wardley mapping, Cynefin, and the ideal present. So I'll throw these two things up here just so we kind of keep those in mind. There we go. And then I just got to find these things. So let's open up the search here from Hired Thought Models. Okay, so here's one. And yeah, here's the other. So here are our two tweets. The first one was this one, pretty straightforward. What do models do? I wanted to know what models do for people. And I got a lot of really interesting responses from folks. So I'm just going to put the link to that over here so I can find it. What do models do? It's kind of funny to think about models as doing things, but I think they do quite a bit for us. And then the second question was, what is the category of thing to which Wardley mapping, Cynefin, ideal present, etc. belong? And I'll throw a link to that over here. All right, we've got our two tweets. These are the two questions. What do models do, and what is the category to which these things belong? Why am I asking these questions? So let's start there. Why these questions? And you may know this. I run learnwardleymapping.com. It's a website. It's a website people seem to use whenever they first encounter Wardley mapping. And they kind of have these questions of their own, right? Like, what is it? What is it good for? Where does it fit into my world? Like, when would I use it? When would I not use it? Lots of interesting questions like that. And I've been studying for the last several years, like, different ways of describing it to people. And I've done better jobs and worse jobs, depending on the day and how things seem to go. Sometimes I'm like, it's like you create your own models and then you ask those models questions, or it's like there's this thing called evolution and it tells you how things change. And I always like find I'm falling flat on my face when it comes to describing these things. So I have a suspicion that we don't have good words. And it's not that good words, perfect words will solve the problems, but we kind of go one of two ways right now when we describe things like Wardley mapping, Cynefin, ideal present, whatever it happens to be. And it's like the problem of the words being too specific. So for example, Dave Snowden calls Cynefin like a ontological epistemological framework or something like that. I probably got that wrong, but whatever. So that is tempting and interesting as a descriptive phrase, and I know why he uses the new fancy words and so on. His assertion is that you need new language in order to be able to talk about new things, new ways of thinking and being about things, and that's fine. I think that's valuable. It is jargon though, and if you if someone asks you, like a coworker asks you, hey, what's Cynefin? First of all, you have to get over the fact that it's a Welsh word. You have to clear up 10 different preconditioned, pre-problems about how to describe what a thing is and how it's useful. It's a tool, but it's it's about yeah, there are these categories of things, but you don't want to use it as a categorization framework, but you want to actually think of it as an ontological framework, and what's ontology, and you just go down this rabbit hole of problems. And so within 30 seconds, someone is whatever, I don't care. And the same thing happens to Wardley mapping, right? So if this is our description of what happens to Cynefin, here's what happens to Wardley mapping, right? It's well, there's this strategy cycle thing, and it's got these parts to it. It's purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, leadership. Oh, and also it overlaps with the OODA loop. So all of a sudden we're talking about John Boyd and OODA and all this stuff. And it's oh, and by the way, it comes from The Art of War. Or rather, that's the origin story of it. And it's okay, already I've got reasons to not like what you're about to tell me. Not only because of the semantic density that's here, without any effort to make it accessible to me, but also there are reasons that I may or may not be interested in those things. Cite it and use it and even hit people with it or whatever is the degree to which they feel superior or feel good about it. And I think that's not a good kind of thing to encourage, because it really pushes everybody else out. It kills the possibility for interesting dialogue, and also it kills the possibility the pathways into these interesting things dead on arrival because a bunch of people are waving around these terms or whatever. So that's what I'm thinking about. So that's one part of this. It's the too specific version of things. And then, of course, the easier part of this to talk about is probably the too generic or meaningless version of things, where instead of this beautiful language, we have these really generic terms oh, it's a thinking tool, or, and in some ways, the jargon problems comes up again, where it's sense-making tool, where if you literally say the words one after the other, you'll figure it out probably. But I don't have a place in my head to put something like this. I don't have people don't have backgrounds in philosophy by default. They don't have backgrounds in complexity. They don't have backgrounds that predispose them to be interested enough to go try to understand what you mean. They're just trying to live their life, do their job, do whatever it is that they're trying to do. They don't care. We have successfully created a situation where nobody cares. And nobody's gonna care, and that's okay. But I think this is an interesting problem because the fact that we use like two generic tools or words to describe these things, or another extreme of two specific language that is totally confusing and irrelevant to people. I mean, either way you get irrelevance and dismissal. And so it's like easy to dismiss something whenever the words don't make sense and we can't even talk about it. So why these questions? I think the answer to that is to make it possible to talk about whatever it ends up being, right? Cynefin, Wardley mapping, other things, ideal present, that kind of stuff. So to make it possible to talk about these things. So I think this is the seed of our map that we'll make here, which is starting at the top. I'll kind of make this map kind of like Simon Wardley makes the map of mapping, like what was Wardley mapping supposed to be for me, described in like almost meta terms. And I'll start at the top with like, hey, it's me. Who's the initial user here? Well, it's Ben. I admit it. This map is for me. I am selfish and interested in answering some of these questions. And what do I need? Well, I need to have a way to talk about, for example, Wardley mapping. And in order for me to have a way to talk about Wardley mapping, I literally need like words. And the words need to resonate with like a certain framing of what it is that we're talking about. Maybe like a brief aside here, like I'm not someone with a deep philosophy background, but I've kind of gotten into some of like the background, like how about now? Oh gosh, sorry about that. Yeah, Joey, I appreciate I appreciate the confirmation on the cat issue. I think it was plugged in. I just reset up my desk for a standing desk configuration, and I plugged everything back in together. And so I think I had the lav mic like plugged into a different port than usual, and weird things ensued. So just give me a heads up if that happens again. Sorry about that. All right. Yeah, I'm gonna blame the cat on that one. Okay, so the Wittgenstein thing, just like maybe the briefer version of that, is basically like Wittgenstein spent the majority of his early philosophy career coming to the conclusion that basically whereof one cannot speak, one should remain silent. And it's this idea that you cannot actually communicate ideas about your own human experience. You cannot communicate that to others because the language that we have just is not precise enough. It's like the words do not mean things that can even remotely come close to the human experience. And I'm sure I'm butchering that explanation, but basically, like, it's a pretty defeating conclusion that, you know, unless we can, and I did this too early in my career where I would badger people about trying to get to the precise definition of words, and it was like really important for me to understand exactly what you meant. It was like, well, what do you mean by that? And it would just annoy people. But I was like seeking that exact technical definition of a word. And unless I could know what you meant by that, I would just get frustrated because I can't understand you. I don't know what you're trying to do. So Wittgenstein basically came to that conclusion that we don't have words that can communicate these experiences. And he just like he's like, I'm done. I've solved philosophy or whatever. Went away for a bit and then came back to the question and ended up coming to a different conclusion on his like second career path. This is like something that took years and years, right? And that second idea is that like people are using language in some interesting ways. They're playing different word games. And the example that I think I've seen used is like water. If someone says water, they could be playing one of a number of different kinds of games. For example, they could be playing a game where they're warning you that water is coming, and it's like water's leaking through the roof, and it's like water. Or they could be making a request that they're thirsty, they want some water, or they could be answering a scientific, or like they're in chemistry class or something like that, and like or whatever, right? And the professor asks a question, and their response is water. Like that kind of thing is these are different kinds of word games, and they all use the same word in different ways. And so the trouble is so often we're not ready to switch modes and play the different games. And so when people use this like really, really precise technical language that we were discussing earlier, where it's like, ontological, epistemological framework, meow, or like, yeah, purpose, landscape, climate doctrine, leadership, like it's so cool, evolution, skidoo, like this is like a word game that is jargon heavy and only works for the in-group, like the people who are already in that group of people who understand the thing. And keyword shibboleth for later. We'll talk about that, I think. But the idea is that like it's immediately expels you from ever being able to learn or really being interested in what's going on here. So what I want are words that fit within existing frames of reference. And I'm not really looking for like the totality, like the exact one or two word phrase that works for everyone. What I'm looking for is more than we have now, which is either too generic, thinking tools or whatever, or too specific, like, the strategy cycle, blah, blah, blah. Where especially because some of those words have already been diluted to the extent that they're meaningless. But I want more options so that I can have a way of talking about this without falling into the kinds of traps that, I basically alluded to here. So I think I need words that allude to certain kinds of frames. So frames being frames of reference. And like, if you think about the Wittgenstein word games, that's kind of what I mean by that, although it's like a little bit different probably, but roughly it's like there's a frame of reference that is already embedded in a social context like your coworkers have, or the different like social groups like product managers or enterprise architects or nonprofit leaders or whatever it ends up having, like whatever it ends up being. Those different people have different frames and they use different words. And so it's like, this is a bundle in a sense. The words and the frame come together. And I'm just like really curious about what words I ought to be playing with that I haven't been playing with. So that's the game right now. And so in order to find out, basically like Ben here needs and like this is the value chain. So if you've never seen a value chain before, Joey and everyone, I know that you know how to do this and all the fun stuff, but like for the rest of the folks who might be watching this later, or those of you who are watching right now, like to do a value chain, it's basically like you have the users, you have the needs, and you have the capabilities, and you're drawing relationships that have dependency, that they basically convey the dependencies, what depends on what else in the system. And so the way that you can check if you have a good value chain is like you've got the parts, right? But then you've got the relationships, and you can basically from top to bottom read like a sentence. You just like put this little word needs, or sometimes to be more clear, I say depends on, and you just read it from top to bottom like this and see if it makes sense. So Ben depends on having a way to talk about, for example, Wardley mapping, or having a way to talk about Wardley mapping depends on a frame of reference, and the frame depends on the words. But like having a way to talk about Wardley mapping also requires that we have the words too. So it's a fun little like thing there. So that's a quick like way to check on that. The other thing is, like I always mention this, you can read it from the bottom to the top too, and you just replace depends on with enables instead. And you just read it in the reverse. So like words enable us to access that frame of reference. The frame of reference enables us to talk about Wardley mapping, but the words enable us to talk about Wardley mapping as well. And that the talking about Wardley mapping enables the Ben, like me. Hello, that's me. So, all right, where do we go from here? So I'm like, this is my selfish value chain, right? Like I'm just interested in myself at the moment, trying to find out the answers to these questions. And so the way, like I need some sort of discovery mechanism for these words. And like the discovery mechanism also is gonna like indirectly help me find out what the frames are, right? Because the words people use, I'll be able to kind of plug into my hypothesis generator of like, oh, you're using some words that I haven't seen before or used that way. What game are you playing? And so I think like maybe what we'll do is go ask some people how they talk about these things and see how they respond. That can be my discovery mechanism. And then we can sort through the results and see what we find. So fast forwarding, I've already done this, right? Like, so coming back, at least I've already done the initial part, like the questions, what do models do, and what is the category to which Wardley mapping can and the ideal present belong. And so I think like literally what I'm just gonna do right now is go one by one through these responses and start making sense of what we find. So if that sounds boring, I'm sorry. I just wanted to hang out and do some work, and maybe like hang out with some folks who like notice things. But if it sounds interesting, then stick around because I think we're gonna get this started here. So the questions, what do models do? And what is the category to which Wardley mapping can and ideal present belong? He's not saying that those things are models. To be like abundantly clear, when I talk about Wardley mapping, what I'm thinking is that like the process of Wardley mapping is that you make a model and then you ask it some questions. Like if I were to like boil it down to 2 steps, that's what I think it's all about. And like, of course, there are things that happen along the way that are really like curious and all that kind of stuff. But like already you can see the problem of having too specific a language. Oh yeah, another like example of a too generic thing is like decision making, or strategy is another good example of having like too generic language that doesn't mean anything, at least in this context. So so make a model, ask it some questions, and it just so happens that Wardley mapping has a very opinionated way about how you make your model. And also it has a very opinionated set of questions that you can ask, and they lend themselves to strategy. Yeah, Daniel. What models do? Eat hot chip and lie. Oh man, I feel like there's a reference I'm not getting there, but I just love that combination of words. It makes me like smile. And I think that's like a great example of like the different kinds of word games that people play, right? Like some people are playing like really precise language word games, use my word right. And other people are like here to have fun. And I like the people who are here to have fun. So Danielle, I appreciate you. So like, if that's the most basic kind of thing, like already we're presupposing that people understand what models are, and we're presupposing that they understand why you would ask it some questions. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of like, first I want to understand like how people think about models. So let's start there. And coming back over to this original tweet, what do models do? I'm just going to go through and pull all the responses, good, bad, and ugly, that I can. This is the point where like if I'd done a little bit more prep work, I probably would have found a way to like scrape Twitter for all of the like use the Twitter API to scrape all the text from a certain like set of replies or whatever. But I haven't done that, so we will have to just do this in the boring way. But what I'm going to do is each of the replies here, I'll probably batch them up like 10 at a time. I'm just going to open them in a new tab, and then we'll kind of use each tab as a way to kind of just like give them some attention and see what they bring us. All right, I love it. I got all sorts of goofy replies. Okay, so here I've stopped at Michael Godix, and we'll start here. So here's a response: simplify complexity. Now this is great. What do models do right? Simplify complexity. All right. Okay. No, I'm probably not going to do the thing where like I evaluate each one based on whether or not I agree with it or whatever. Like that kind of way of doing it sort of shuts down the curiosity around the word game question. Like, what game is this person playing? So I'm going to just like kind of go one by one through it here, and we'll if I need to ever find these tweets again and find the source and stuff like that and ask the person questions, I can just use Twitter search for that text replying to me, and that'll help me go find it again. So I love this one. Models do nothing. They are simplified and or idealized layers of abstract. Oh gosh. Okay. So here we go. Gotta make this bigger. Simplified and or idealized layers of abstraction / concepts which we can potentially use to communicate with other people. But I love the models do nothing, because it's like it's a contrarian response in a sense, right? And I like that's pretty fun to kind of look at. All right, I'm not totally sure I'm parsing this yet, so I'm just going to keep moving, and we'll see what else we find. So Matthias says they prevent us from understanding things most of the time. And when I received this one, my mind kind of exploded for a moment, because this made me think about the possibility of, as a metaphor, so in Java, there's a garbage collection mechanism. And it's a way of like sweeping away things that we don't need anymore, right? So in our minds, we have like latent models that don't actually hold up to any sort of scrutiny. And yet, because we don't examine them or confront them, we assume that they are true or assume that they are there at all. So I kind of like this idea that like those models are hanging out and preventing us from understanding what's going on in our world. And so like in a weird way, when we confront people with these processes of modeling and thinking and so on, like we're actually first and foremost sweeping away all of the detritus, all the old models that don't really make sense. So at least that was like the seed of that idea. So that was kind of interesting. And then moving on here, capture imagination, evoke discussion, present viewpoints, cause having coffee with others and exchange thoughts. Yes, it's like a spontaneous, like, let's go discuss. It's a what do you call it? Almost like an attractor, maybe. Help elaborate findings, discover we're wrong in so many ways, and guide us. Yes. Up next, Hai Nguyen says, they walk the runway. So there's a different kind of word game, right? It's like, play the joke game. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Yeah, one of the things that I love about the George Box quote too is that like, there's a secondary part of it, which is basically about tigers and mice. And I'll save it for another time so I don't get distracted, but you can Google that if you're into it. Tristan says, even if a model is valid, it makes it harder to see things not described by the model. Yes, actually, yes. And one of the things I'm hoping we'll get to later, kind of once we get through some of these responses, is some of these papers that people recommended I read as a result of these questions. One of them is Fuck Nuance by Kieran Healy, and it's in Sociological Theory. It's a 2017 article. And then the other one is by Iris van Ruij, I think is how you say that. And it's called Psychological Models and Their Distractors. And those two things kind of like have really been interesting to stew on today, because actually like the Fuck Nuance paper has this idea that like the actual thing that makes theory useful is what it doesn't include. And so one of the problems that it's describing in a sociological, like academia in sociology, is like the issue of like people claiming that it's virtuous to basically make things more nuanced. And so like the practical refutation of that claim is or rather that practical refutation of that as a value statement is that the thing that makes theory is actually that it has less things in it. And that kind of translates to models as well, right? Like models are a curation of reality, and you've chosen to include some things and to reject other things entirely. And I think that's important. And like this kind of anti-nuance stance is interesting because I definitely find myself advocating for nuance. But I think because they're in a different context, the way that they're talking about it is different. Like they're talking about a specific problem in an academic context where like nuance is like the thing, it's like all the rage. Whereas our problem, I think, is that we have too many folks who oversimplify things. Excuse me. And those folks like pretend things are simpler than they actually are. And that creates a lot of problems. And so of course we're saying more nuance, more nuance, more nuance. Things like Wardley mapping can pretty quickly lend themselves to excess. You can get lost really fast. Just getting lost in the details, trying to model reality with extreme nuance and detail and perfection. And like really you kind of need to back out a little bit and stay high level, at least on your first passes, and then select where to invest and increase that detail. Yeah. And so like, Tristan, I like this point that you're making because exactly, like the model is only useful in one little tiny facet of things. And that makes it useful. And like you can't really take that to an extreme though and say that it's permanently useful. Like it's useful everywhere, or it's useful for everything. Like you do have to have the counterbalancing force of like, okay, this is insufficiently specific. I believe that wholeheartedly. Okay, so that's high. Romeo, love the joke answer here. Answers that attempt to be legible on the quote tweet. I love it. And then he says, let's go on the next tweet for answer from the bottom of my heart. And I thought like he shared something really interesting. So models are attempts of negotiating meaning. So I'm just going to capture that. Attempts at negotiating meaning. A very common way of developing meaning is isomorphisms, which I am not too prideful to say I don't know what an isomorphism is. In modern algebra, a one-to-one correspondence mapping between two sets that reserves binary relationships between elements in the sets. That does not help me, but I'm going to just keep reading. Oh, it's a sociological thing too. Okay. Similarities of the processes or structures of one organization to those of another. Okay, let's look at the context and see what this says. They create an internal model that is shared in an attempt to create a shared model. Okay, that makes everything make sense. And this actually is described in this paper that I was referring to early by Kieran Healy. No, this was Iris's model. or Iris's paper, Psychological Models and Their Distractors. And what they say is, contrary to mental models, which live in a person's mind, scientific models are transparent and public, that is, external representations. And so like this is coming from a psychology background, so of course like both of these are academic contexts. Excuse me. But I think we can learn from them. So this isomorphism concept makes sense, at least the sociological frame of that, like the internal mental model, which I externalize in order to hopefully make it a shared mental model. Yeah, correspondence. Yep. In an attempt of socially creating meaning through negotiation. Yes, and negotiation is the key word. For those of you who know Jabe, yeah, you've probably heard him say negotiation a bunch of times. Jabe Bloom at Sciatane on the Twitters. Negotiation is like a big deal, actually. And it's not like you get 40% of the cut, I get 60%. It's more like you think that word means something, and I'm not sure I agree with you yet. In fact, if you use that word in that way, it will be surprising to me and disrupt our ability to do what we are trying to do. So like that kind of negotiation where like we need to like maybe talk about that a little bit, and maybe I need to figure out which word game you're playing, and vice versa. Okay, so Romeo goes on, we try to create commonality. To do that, we try to share understanding. To do that, we send a version of our inner understanding that invites the others in order to form ours. To do that, we choose a slice, and Romeo mentions reduction, which is like breaking things down into parts, I think in this case. Abstraction, which is like, as I learned in this paper by Iris, that was the Healy paper. It's abstraction defined as like taking all the differences from the different things and removing them and like paring them down to what they hold in common and then calling that a thing. So that kind of abstraction, and then compression, which is like removing like duplicate kind of things or like, you know, that kind of stuff, in order to basically take up less space in an idea. Although that word might be used in a different way here, I'm not totally sure. I wonder what game he's playing with that word. And all that of what we perceive, and it is a curation. And like curation really seems important to maybe not what models do, but what they are, at least, or how they become. And Romeo goes on, we give that, and in giving it, we give ourselves. We give the gift of ourselves, the gift of being seen, in an attempt to create an us. And by creating an us, changing the I. That's pretty dope. I love the way that is said. That is both what the model is and what the model does, and what the model does to us. Yes. Okay. So the inherent struggle of creating a common is one in modeling, in thinking, in linguistics, and in art. That is a good phrase I want to like capture and put on the board here. The inherent struggle of creating a common is one in modeling, in thinking, in linguistics, and in art. Whew. All right, and Romeo has another talk we can dig into if we want to know more later. Excellent. All right, thank you, Romeo. Lee gives us another paper here to read and says, models are a form of simplification and compression that aid cognition. I like aiding thinking. Cognition aid. It's an interesting word to use. I like John. This is like probably John. I don't know many people who have spent more time thinking on this class of problem than John. Creating shared understanding really does cut to the heart of it, in a sense. The problem or the critique of that, I guess, is that it feels an awful lot like it's over here. And that makes it kind of powerless. unless it happens to resonate for the right audience, right? So I don't know. That one's tough. But I love that because it is what it does. It's the part where we prompt a negotiation helps us come together to create a thing that we share, and that creates that shared understanding, which makes a lot of like explaining why I did a thing or why you did a thing more of a tacit process. We already understand because we know what page we're on. Sue Borchard, concrete constructs for synthesizing thoughts about a phenomenon, real-life manifestations of some theory or ideal. I'm just going to capture these. Tools for thinking, deciding, acting together and alone, like camera, positions, frame. Yeah. And that's the lovely thing, is that these aren't like necessarily social technologies, but in a sense, like you could probably say that they are because of the way that you even do it with yourself. Like when I wordly map by myself, I kind of like, it's like a dialogue with myself. I'm asking myself questions and I'm deciding what I think. I'm noticing where I'm uncertain. All that fun stuff. Jabe comes in with a model doing the split. Thank you, Jabe. And there's a whole thread of those particular jokes. Fun fact, this particular move, as I think this is Chris Combe mentions, this is called the death drop. So that is a specific move, which is fabulous. Michael McClement says, satisfy formal theories, and links to an article about model theory. Michael Godek invokes Herbert Simon. You might start to wonder what you think about that isn't a model. Yep. When you think about modeling, you might start thinking that modeling is just a way to get better at thinking. So yes. So like so far you're probably noticing like some patterns, some words that people seem to be using. We haven't really hit anything yet that I think is like truly transformative, but like there's some really interesting ideas that change at least the way that I think about it. Simplify complexity is also a theme. The phrase that I think it was the paper on nuance, cutting through complexity, as an example of that. So there's a theme there. There's obviously like the intellectualized version of it. There's the better way of thinking version of it. So shared understanding is another thing as well. Oh, that's so funny, Daniel. The comment that you just left got flagged by YouTube because I assume because it includes either profanity or Jordan Peterson, and I'm not sure which one that is, but hilarious nonetheless. So I just let it pass through there. Climate is everything. Ha-ha! Oh, man. Bless us. So, moving on from Michael. Here's Bruno, and I'll kind of get our next batch of ideas here. I'm going to have to be really careful not to reload this page. Otherwise, the order of the replies will change. And then I will be screwed. But we are risking everything, and that's okay. All right. Making progress. Express assumptions, Bruno says. Yes. Express assumptions. Ben Honer says, allow us to simultaneously hold, remember, and manipulate more concepts than our brain can by themselves. Yes. And that reminds me of placeholding, which is something that Tiago Forte taught me about, like with note-taking. Just like the idea of like placeholding as like a thing that you can pick back up. If you structure your thinking and what you do in a certain way so that you can pick it back up real quickly. I think models do that same kind of thing, but it can be even how you structure notes, for example. It's just a quality of that. So we got Victor here, describe a system if we talk about models and not frameworks. Fair enough. Describe a system. If we use models as in common tongue, enable faulty comprehension. Ouch, rude. No, I like Victor, it's funny. Okay, but like also, just reminds me of this this one from Matthias up here, right? They prevent us from understanding things. Curious. And James here makes the callback reference. Let's see, who mentioned George Box? Yeah, Daniel mentioned George Box. So all models or some. Thank you, James. Peter says, they help you to engage more brain centers. Their inertia allows the brain to focus longer on the scope and create a shared objective thing to allow misunderstanding in a team to become explicit. The thing I'm taking away from that is that last part, allow misunderstanding in a team to become explicit. I talk a lot about how Wardley Mapping helps people realize things that they ought to know, but that they in fact do not know. And they may think they know it, but it's like in truth, when it comes to actually explain it or to walk through it or to describe it in specifics, they can't. And so that prompts a moment of like, oh, ah. And then the other side of that is like, you're saying digital transformation, I'm saying digital transformation. You're thinking of Wi-Fi routers, I'm thinking about mobile phones or something. I don't know. And the idea is like the word as a handle can mean many different things. It goes back to the Wittgenstein word games problem. And we need to like once you start taking apart the thing and getting into the first layer of detail, suddenly those conflicts become very explicit. Yes, Tristan, the word legible is perfect. Liana, my wife in the room, is probably laughing hearing me say that word. That is an inside joke. She hates me when I say legible, and it's because it's so funny. All right, and then what can we learn from platforms? About platforms, it's an article. I'll have to like go read about that one later, come back to it. Tell stories of mental models. Tell stories of mental models. Those stories help us consolidate highly complex ideas into easy to grasp concepts. So you tell stories, and we consolidate highly complex ideas into easy to grasp concepts. Technically wrong, but they have to be to convey the fundamental meaning. Yeah, going back to the map and the territory thing. Yep. Oh, look, George Box pops up again. It's surprising how that happens. Models reduce the amount of information radiating from a thing so that you can fit one aspect of that thing into your head. So there are a lot of stuff, cut down to have fewer things, fit the important aspects of that thing into your head. Awesome. Okay. Organize sensory experiences into actionable understanding, perceptions of reality. And then they also recognize contexts and frame and direct attention. Framing and directing attention, yeah, that seems, yeah. The frame is a negotiation, like a negotiable thing. Directing attention is like so much of questions like about strategy and things like that. Models allow you to communicate, think about the thing being modeled. This is helped by being a simplification that spotlights detail important for some purpose and that tosses out detail not important for that purpose. You can almost like identify the school of thoughts that are different through here. It's kind of curious. Giving an incomplete example Oh, sorry, giving an incomplete explain me like I'm 5. So I kind of like, this one is a cross, I think, between a joke and also like some truth in that joke. Like if we come over to the enabling faulty comprehension kind of thing, that's interesting. Models do nothing, we do things. Models, like all tools, are things we use to do things. All right. Fine. I know what game you're playing. Models are to descriptions as math is to language. At least I think that's what that means. It has been a long time since I did one of those. Bam. There we go. Models don't do anything. They represent an abstraction of something. Not wrong. Okay, next batch. Boom, boom, boom. Uh-oh. Just realized you'll all find out who I've muted. Dun, dun, dun. All right, so here we go. They are strongly opinionated about what is important, so allow you to hide surprises. Strongly opinionated about what is important. So the hiding surprises part I don't understand yet. And it could be like the, like one way of thinking of that could be that like, as a political tool, you can work in the space that's not modeled and therefore have free reign to do things that can't be spoken of because they're not part of the model. That's one way. And again, going back to Wittgenstein and word games, like we're just trying to understand what people are saying with these. Definitely strongly opinionated. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Susan, I love Susan. Sell cars. Yeah, you right. And then James with, what is that, Zoolander? I was sheltered as a child, so I missed a lot of like the goofy references. Thank you, James. And then structure and maybe obfuscate thinking. Yep. So that one's interesting because it talks both about like the structure, like there's a thinking process, let's structure the process so that we can think, and then obfuscating it in the sense that like, you can hide stuff in it. Again, I'm really curious what people are thinking about when they talk about like these negative aspects. And like, it's not that I disagree, it's just like, it's interesting what's going on in there. Okay, mostly overfit. What do models do? They overfit. And like, I don't have a background. Surprise might be in the sense of noise or entropy, like in information theory. Oh, yeah, interesting. Oh, that would make sense. So going back to this one right here, they're strongly opinionated about what is important, so allow you to hide surprises. Yeah, that would make sense in that. Thank you, Daniel. And then again, I'm gonna have to do some Googling again, like overfit model. A condition where a statistical model begins to describe the random error in the data rather than the relationship between variables. Ah, yes, okay. That was something that they discussed in the nuance paper as well. They talked about like, oh, we should just add more variables, right? At least I think that's what that was about. So, okay, overfitting, yes. That was an unproductive discussion. They try to abstract reality into useful bits. They lead to good, healthy outdoor entertainment. Fair enough. And actually, like, I know one of the reasons why I'm including the joke responses is, like, when we go back to the question that we're here to kind of explore a little bit, if what we're hoping to do, here we go. If what we're hoping to do is have a new way to talk about Wardley mapping, then we also have to understand how people will perceive the words that we use. And if we say the word model, jokes are actually a pretty good way to tell, like, what kind of ways that they'll be perceived. So I think that's actually important. The other thing here is facilitate decision making. That kind of falls back under that, like, perhaps too generic description, but it's useful to see because, like, that's what people say. In fact, when David and I were talking about this, David Hall, facilitating decision making seemed to be, like, the important thing where we were getting, like, really into it. Okay. Yes. All right. So I think I've pulled in all the responses. Great. What do models do? Now we have some ideas. We have some information. All right, so one thing we could do is we could try to sort through this information and try to find some patterns. I want to maybe almost take a detour. And to take that detour, I think I'm going to, like, fire up my scanner and pull in highlights from these papers that I was reading, because I think there's some interesting things there that we should get into. So hold on one second. I'm just gonna step away while I get the scanner. All right, and hopefully this will just work, and then we can. So I don't know if you know this, but Miro has a lovely OCR system where you can just upload photos and it'll turn them into sticky notes. You have to do a little bit of work to make it happen, but it does work. So this first paper is psychological models and their distractors. Oopsie-daisy. Do. So forgive me while we have a little bit of downtime while I scan this bad boy in. Yay! In the meantime, I will find a link to a paper for you so that you can follow along as well. This would be Iris van Rouge, I think. And I'll throw this link into chat. Oh, and it's interesting because, like, we didn't... Oh, yeah, because this was a quote tweet, so we missed some of the things that were quote tweets here. But here's the link to the paper. If you're interested, I'm throwing that in chat. Okay. Yeah, and, like, the response that Iris gave was from the paper. It describes 4 elements. It's the object, so the thing being represented by the model, the thing doing the representing, so the medium that you're using to express that model, the content, so the representation, like the actual meaning that you're trying to encode in the meaning, or in the medium, and then the agent or system using the representation. So that's us, like us perceiving that and picking it up. And that's, like, a really interesting kind of thing. Okay, so I've got that scanned in. Let me see here. I'm very smart with the technology and such, so I of course know how to save this as an image that I can upload into the computer box. Ooh, let me do that. Okay, cool. So in case you don't know, Miro has this thing called stickies capture, which is pretty neat. So in a Miro board, if you just click on the little menu along the left-hand side to open it up, stickies captures right here, and it'll prompt you to upload an image, and then you can just kind of like align some little boxes with, oh goodness, yeah, something messed up with my scan, but you know, we'll live. So yeah, so this is gonna be a little bit noisy, but it'll kind of get us here. It'll at least get my highlights here. So this is the first, there are only 2 pages, so don't worry, this won't take long. But this will give us enough to like edit down into some statements that I think will be interesting to think about and think with as we look at the data of what like people say. And here's the definition that she mentioned, so I won't capture that bit, but it is here. We're just doing like live analysis today, which is like pretty fun. All right, and I'll do this one page at a time just so we don't like get stuck, like bored. Okay, so not you. We've got the highlights that I want to play with. I'm gonna get them on the board. Without models, scientists can easily fool themselves into thinking that they have understood and explained phenomena when they have not. I love that. Like, that's just spicy. Thank you, Iris, for this. It's so good. Models help scientists think better. They provide cognitive scaffolds for thinking further and more rigorously. I like this. So the idea of like a cognitive scaffold is interesting. It comes back to the placeholding idea. The object of a scientific model is the target system. So the object, remember from our definition over here, the thing being represented. The object of a scientific model is the target system, the workings of which a psychologist, because this is from the background of psychology, wishes to understand and explain. So models like have you target a thing that you wish to understand and explain. So I'm just gonna like separate out some of these big ones. Understand and explain. Provide cognitive scaffolds for thinking further and more rigorously. So like one part of that is the cognitive scaffolds. The other part of that is the thinking further and more rigorously. And again, like cognitive scaffold is like technical language, which is useful for us to talk about this thing, but like everybody else is gonna be like, boring. Or more just like, it's confusing. What are you talking about? Okay. An unaided scientist's mind is unable to achieve comparable levels of insights about the inner workings of complex systems. Yes, yeah, so like models are helpful for aiding, so you can't understand those things. A model can be expressed as a sketch or an image. And also in this paper, they describe like more formal language, symbolic representation, mathematical models, that kind of thing. The other thing that like became conspicuous here is models help you overcome a false sense, or rather like it's a problem that you might have a false sense that you already have models when one has foils. And the thing that is like really interesting there is like comes up on the second page, which we'll get to in a bit, which is like narratives are almost like you can convince yourself that you have a model when all you have is a narrative. And there's a nice rant on YouTube, if you look for something that Jabe and I did about coherence versus correspondence theories of truth. I think that describes that phenomenon in an interesting way. The content of a scientific model is what it says about the target system. Yes. And then a model represents the target system by postulating system components. So what are the things and their interactions? What is the mechanism? That feels very familiar to me. Especially about how like I talk about Wardley mapping and things like that. So, and that was Iris's answer. Like, models represent. Yep. By postulating system components and their interactions. Which I would rephrase as just like, what are the things and how do they interact? Okay, page 2. Let's see. Sticky's capture again, page 2. I liked this paper talking about like what models are not. I think they're like, there's a lot to be said about that, I think. But my favorite of which was the narratives are not models. To think better and prevent us from fooling ourselves into thinking that we've understood or explained something when we have not. Oh. Brutal. And this last sentence, I think I abbreviated it. I'm just going to read it for you here. Create the preconditions for... Here's the full quote. If we care about having more models in psychology, we need to create the preconditions for model development and dissemination. And I just like, whenever I notice people speaking in terms of conditions, I find that interesting because like it shows that they're thinking about like gardening, not necessarily like creating a machine that produces this output. I like that a lot. Daniel, I love this. A lot of this reminds me of Knopp's definition of economists, stating the obvious in terms of the incomprehensible. Interested to hear more about narratives or not models. Yeah, we'll come back to that because I think that's very shortly. Because I do think that's actually kind of important and interesting. Okay. So here's another just quick phrase on models: to think better and prevent us from fooling ourselves into thinking that we have understood or explained something when we have not. And that's like, whenever I map with someone, that like oftentimes they will think the exercise at first is boring or like not useful, and that's, I have ways around that now that I didn't used to have, but like it's because they think they understand something when they don't. And it's a humbling experience to have that happen. So the model, like the creation of a model, which is part of the first step of Wardley mapping, like what are the users, what are the needs, what are the capabilities, how do they fit together? Like that's exactly what Iris is talking about here. With like, where was it here? Postulating the system components. What are the parts and their interactions? How do they fit together? And that's like just, it's basically the equivalent of saying, explain to me in detail how this thing works. How does your business work? How does your organization work? How does it produce met needs for users in the market? And people think they understand that, and as soon as they're asked to explain it, they can't. So they have to go discover how it actually works. And this is the other thing. Contrary to mental models which live in a person's mind, I read this earlier before we were playing around here. Scientific models are transparent and public. That is external representations. Whereas mental models are internal and private. Lots of public-private kind of flavors here to kind of explore and think about. Okay, so we've got our one paper. Let me see. I'll just like, I think probably because it's less tedious for you all, instead of scanning things in and doing like sticky notes, I'll just type the highlights in that I think are important. So there's this other paper. Oh, right, I promised we would talk about the narratives. So before I do that then, let me just grab a screenshot of this, and then we'll talk specifically about what Iris says here. Narratives are not models. A story helps a reader to build a model in their head. Hence, it is understandable that sometimes authors feel that their narrative is a model. However, in that case, it's ultimately the reader and author who makes the model in their head, and different readers might do so differently because of ambiguities inherent in natural language. Now, the interesting thing, and where I get like a little bit stuck, or not stuck, but like engaged, I think, is regardless of what language you use, even if you think it is completely and totally unambiguous, I think you'll still run into this problem. Now, I think what Iris is saying here is that narratives as a process, like if you have a story about how something works, that just means that you have a series of things that make sense together. And you're just using their relative coherence to describe how you think something works. And that's how you get like conspiracy theories and QAnon. Again, that's like the whole like thread. If you look on YouTube for the coherence versus correspondence theories of truth, that it's a video that Jabe and I did. Like we kind of dig into this, and he gets a lot of this like explanation out of his head. Narratives are a process by which you can convince yourself that you have a model or a theory, and like you don't actually have something. You just have a process that generates meaning to you. It is not something that creates shared understanding. So if I were like to create an ultimate description of a model, it seems like shared understanding is at least one of the things we're aiming to do. But like even when we have a model that is externalized, or a proposed scientific model using Iris's language, I think the language is still going to represent the barrier to being able to create like take it from a privately held thing to a commonly held thing. Yeah. What are the minimal requirements referenced? Oh, yes. Let me make sure I reference the right thing. So let me, I think it's, if I'm remembering correctly, it's that 4-part thing that she mentions here. The object, the medium, the meaning, and the user. But let me just double check because I might be misquoting. Yeah, I do believe that's what's being referenced here. I'll have to double check that, but definitely take a look at the paper. And thanks for stopping by, Joey. Appreciate you hanging out here for a bit. Hope you have a lovely evening and all that fun stuff. Oh no, you're doing taxes. Killing me. Yeah, I don't even want to think about it right now. Yeah, so I think that's what Iris is referencing here. And like, this is one of those things where like, I definitely don't know. I don't have like a lot of background to be like able to authoritatively like make claims about this stuff. I just know what I have to work with and try to make sense of. So I'm not so much worried about like whether or not this is like applicable generically to all the models that we make to describe like thinking processes or to like do strategy or whatever it ends up being. And like, this is in a context, right? This is in a context of psychology. This other paper that we're going to look at is like in the context of sociology. And those are just going to need different things. Because both of those are also in academia in a certain sense, right? So, and like, a lot of our problems are different, but it's just peeking our heads up a little bit to go see what other people have done that I think is really important. And so this is like a useful way to frame it, I think. So again, if you want to take a look at the paper, it's in the chat. There's a link to it. This is by Iris van Ruij, if I'm saying that correctly, at Iris van Ruij. Super helpful. I found this like really enlightening, at least to help me think about this a little bit. And Kurt says, I think narratives come well after models and maps, but to tell a story, you need to know what's happening. Well, so like, that's like if you're doing strategy deployment, right? Like, so if you are deliberately constructing a narrative from a particular thought out model of what it is that we're trying to do here, that's like deliberate deployment, right? And I can see like how you could be talking about like tacit models, for example, where like there's just like underlying things that we're not aware of that are modeling, that we're using to depend on. But like what I think is being criticized here is when the narrative comes first. And that goes back to that correspondence versus coherence theory thing, where like you can explain the world in terms of conspiracy theories because you can string along a series of like coincidences or possibilities, and as long as it makes sense together, fine. But if you ever try to invalidate any one part of that, the whole chain collapses. Whereas if you're doing a model-based thing, the model does or does not correspond to reality, and you can test that. So like that's a whole different like thing. But yeah. Kurt says, I find trying to show people a worthy map, they lack context for it, but everyone can listen to a narrative. Most people also can't read a real map either. That's fair, yeah. Yeah, and bluntly, I would never, unless I was specifically trying to do it in a provocative way, I would never walk into a group of strangers with a worthy map and say like, read my map. That's really kind of rude, right? Because they don't have any frame of reference. And that's the whole problem that we're trying to solve here, is that like, or rather the problem that we're trying to explore is that like, our ways of speaking of these things are inadequate. And they either fall into like too generic concepts that people don't even like have a way of understanding what it is that you're talking about. Strategy, what does that mean? I don't know. Shared understanding? Okay. Decision making? Boring. I don't know what it is yet, right? And then there's like the really like comprehensive jargony versions of things, right? And those people just shut off, right? And that brings us back to what we're doing, which is just how can we find a way to talk about things like Wardley mapping using words that people help. Oh my God. All right. Yeah, I have missed the discourse around shape rotators versus word cells, and I think I'm better for it. So I'm going to continue with the horse blinders. Yeah, so let's see, where do we go from here? So we've covered the narrative thing, which I think is really interesting. So then there's this other paper. Let's see. Nuance. So this one put a link to this tweet in chat as well. You just said Procrustean bed, which the only other person I've ever heard use that phrase is Jabe. And I assume it has something to do with crustaceans. So I'm going to continue along my ignorant ways with that for now, until someone beats me over the head with a baseball bat. Okay. And it's like, Procrustean bed is, and this is why you should know it. Anyways. We like to have fun here, right? So I've got this paper, which I just linked in the chat. Fuck Nuance by Kieran Healy. The abstract is interesting. It says, nuance is not a virtue of good sociological theory. Although often demanded and superficially attractive, nuance inhibits the abstraction on which good theory depends. I describe 3 nuance traps common in sociology and show why they should be avoided on grounds of principles, aesthetics, and strategy. The argument is made without prejudice to the substantive heterogeneity of the discipline. Keywords, theory, comma, nuance, comma, models, comma, F word. Thank you, Daniel, for acknowledging my crab joke. Okay, so let's see what's useful here. So some quotes that I highlighted were things like model systems are very useful sorts of fictions that foster collaborative investigation of the world. Very useful sorts of fictions that foster collaborative investigation of the world. I'm going to just skim through here and make sure I'm only pulling out the stuff relevant to models. Although going back to like the overall intellectualizing of this stuff, this paper talks about the connoisseur. And this is what it says. It's the insinuation that a sensitivity to nuance is a manifestation of one's distinctive, often metaphorically expressed and at times seemingly ineffable, ability to grasp and express the richness, texture, and flow of social reality itself. This is the nuance of the connoisseur. It is mostly a species of self-congratulatory symbolic violence. Woo! Okay, there was a good quote here on abstraction. And I think I mentioned this earlier. So abstraction is a way of thinking where new ideas or conceptions are formed by considering several objects or ideas and omitting the features that distinguish them. It's like if you've ever tried to learn math the hard way and then you find a quick little trick and it just immediately makes something make sense. For me, this phrasing of abstraction is just like perfect. It's just really interesting. Just completely unlocks the way I think about that. Like, wow, okay. And that's citing a paper. Here's the context for that. The most important thing about a theory is whether it is any good. Demands for more nuance actively inhibit the process of abstraction that good theory depends on. What is abstraction here? It is not simply generalization, that is, the production of law-like statements like, all ravens are black, or all social revolutions are precipitated by fiscal crisis in the presence of divided elites. And there's a citation here for Hempel and Oppenheim, 1948. And then it reads, it is not metaphorical or analogical reasoning either. Analogical reasoning is a common and powerful tool for theory, and it has abstract elements, but it is more involved process than simple abstraction. Referencing Hess, 1966, and Stebbing, 1933. And so this definition right here, that abstraction is a way of thinking where new ideas or conceptions are formed by considering several objects or ideas and omitting the features that distinguish them. This is from Rosen from 2014. And goes on to say that this sort of abstraction is part of the guts of social theory. By doing it, we produce the concepts that we use to make explanatory generalizations, or that we analogize with across cases. I feel like I need that part. Produce concepts that we use to make explanatory generalizations. And I'm not sure the analogizing helps here, but it's good enough. Okay, so moving on, let's see if there's any other quotes here. Yeah, and just like, because it's interesting, this paper talks about how one of the ways that nuance in this context becomes used as a bludgeon is like, whenever someone puts forward a theory, it's assessed in terms of what they basically failed to include or cover in the theory. And I think like the extreme version of this is basically like every theory therefore must be a theory of everything, which is super annoying. Yeah, coarse graining entails some loss of detail difference. Yeah. Yeah, so the specifics here, people complain that some level or dimension has been left out and they demand that it be brought back in. And like the paper goes on to describe that as an unconstrained process. And it's really about just an ever-expanding scope. And like whatever seems important becomes like, I don't know, it becomes like the thing that must be included. Anything that quote unquote matters. So the specific examples they mentioned in sociology is like, oh, well, class doesn't talk about class. Does it talk about institutions? Does it talk about emotions, structure, culture, interaction? Well, if you don't have those things, then it's not a theory. It's like, whoa, all right. Yeah. So I think the argument here is basically that that's not useful. Because it means that like to contribute anything to a discussion on theory, you have to like have an answer for everything. And that's just not useful. It's not helpful. Okay, anything else about models? I've already griped about connoisseurs, so I'm going to skip over that. Although the phrase degenerate forms of trying to be interesting, such as pretending something is counterintuitive when to the audience it is plainly not. Oof. And there's some interesting like final arguments here about like how the works that people like where people are surpassed by their works, I guess, is not necessarily the ones that are the most nuanced and detailed and fine and all that fun stuff, right? It's the stuff that like was clear and simple and cut through a bunch of messiness. So, where does that leave us? We have a bunch of information here. I think like if I were on my own and not dragging you along with me in this through the mud of this particular journey, I would probably want to go through here and just do a bunch of like really analytical things where I just sort, categorize, deduplicate, split, group, all that kind of stuff. And let's see. This is models WTF. What I'll try to do here, like in case you find it interesting, I'll probably turn editing off later, but what I'll do is I'll just throw this board link into chat. It might be view only by the time, if you're like listening to the recording, you play this back. It might be view only by then, but if you want to play around and look around and you move stuff around, you're welcome to. Probably should have done that earlier, but whatever. Okay, so, and here's the thing, like this is just the one question. We have the other question. Okay, so what do models do? Boom, boom. And then what is the category to which Wardley Mapping, Cognition, and ideal present and everything belong? There's like a whole other set of things to go playing with. Yeah, I think I'm gonna bite that off tonight. I'm gonna do it. So let me just open this link here. Kurt says, one aspect of abstraction is also active acknowledgement of here be dragons, instead of the tacit, we don't know exactly what's here, but close enough. Yeah, ooh, okay. And there's something, yeah, anytime we hide stuff, we have to be very careful about not hiding it in a way that it becomes a landmine. And because models are about curation and about like representing a vast messiness, when we deliberately choose to hide stuff, and this actually goes back to the other part of that George Box quote, which I alluded to like way a while ago, about mice and tigers. If I can find it here. Yeah, here we go. So the quote basically continues, so all models are wrong, but some are useful. So you've heard that a million times. Here's the part that you haven't heard. Since all models are wrong, the scientist must be alert to what is importantly wrong. It is inappropriate to be concerned about mice when there are tigers abroad. That is just like, for me. So when you're refining a model, if you hide a tiger and it bites you in the ass later, probably not a good thing to have done. So yeah, that's it. On point, Kurt. All right, what is the category of thing to which Wardley Mapping, Cognition, ideal present, etc. belong? I tried to shape some of these responses by offering some forbidden words. You might recognize some of them, such as sense-making, strategy. I actually forbade the use of models and decision-making. And there were a bunch of others that I should have forbidden, like tools, but oh well, we learn. And I'll just batch these up and go through them. Boom, boom, boom. And then boom, and then boom, and then getting our list here. This is about the time when Chrome starts complaining about how much memory it's using. Okay, first response. Let me just get this set up over here. It is a picture of our current situation, including the open and contested space around us. This is where like the word games get really fun, referring to our earlier Wittgenstein conversation. Because like the descriptions people are using are way more interesting for this question, I think, than the models question. And like modeling is embedded in a lot of these practices, sort of secretly. So yeah, okay. John comes in with like all the answers because he has struggled with these questions for a lot longer than I have. So I'm just going to duplicate some of his things. So information, collective consciousness, boop, boop, boop. Thinking together. Narrative. My personal favorite, ontologies. Because I think I like that view of it. Like what are the things? What is existence? Framework, structured thinking, which is another version of that I really like, and then theories. And he goes on to say, a social culture system of designated behaviors and practices, morals, beliefs, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, or organizations. Boom. Socio-cultural. Joey. Oh, you were just here. New stuff. Yeah, actually, like, part of this is, like, so the word game that I'm gonna, since Joey's not here, I'm gonna speak on his behalf. Like, the word game here seems to be, like, the novelty stuff. Like, there have been many, tools, or whatever you want to call these things, there are many of them before now, right? Current reality trees, for example. At least as far as, like, modeling and decision-making tools. Value stream maps, all that stuff. And so it's almost like Wardley Mapping, Kinevin, ideal present, and everything is like the novelty. Create more ability to discern the logos of the world, or to get closer to understanding the Tao. Sorry, the Tao. And I always forget which is which. Logos, pathos, ethos. Logos appeals to the audience as reason, building up logical arguments. So there we go. Crutches. Yeah, dog. I would. I want to hear more about what you were saying about VGR, because the response. Yeah, the 2x2 cracked me up. Prediction, even if that's not what they're supposed to be for, that's how capitalism uses them. Ooh, and there was one there that I missed, near state foresight. A point-in-time narrative device for planners. Phil chimes in with narrative explorers, social objects, writing prompts. I almost wanted to add on creative fiction writing prompts. Some of our strategies and so on fit that bill. Matthias comes in with Wardley Mapping and ideal present are methods. The outcome is predetermined by the choice of the method. So I'll just add methods. And then he comes in with Kinevin is an intuition pump. It can push thinking in unexpected directions, such as the creation of a novel method. And this seems to be an argument that like Kinevin is different and special, and it is. But because I'm not looking for the precision, I'm not really looking to describe these as different things. I'm actually looking for the generic, or a generic way of describing this set of activities. Like, I wrote this elsewhere. It's like this is a language discovery exercise more than it is about a precision of description exercise. Better models for reflecting concurrent living and evolving ecosystems. So there's like the ecosystem modeling part of this that seems really interesting. Generative heuristic tools. Gonna need that one broken down at some point. It goes on to say, tools that help us see virtual constraints and conditions. Virtual as opposed to actual? That's a good question. Don't know. Thinking tools. We've heard that one. Tom's response, I know a few thinking tools, but not. Party games. And that's like chaos. Like, I love it. Like, this is like chaotic good. Turn these into party games. Visual conversation facilitators. Now this smells like the right kind of thing. Like it's one of those, like, you know, when you see it, and it's like this isn't quite right either, but like this is like the right class of direct answer that could, like, for example, be tested to see how people engage with it. This is about category creation. This is about creating a class of things on its own that we can talk about doing that doesn't fit into the old ways of thinking about it, like strategy or modeling or whatever it ends up being. Something that is unto itself, that helps people immediately understand where it fits into their world. And if they know where it fits, then they know why they might learn it. And like, this is not like 100% perfect, accurate, whatever, but it's like, this might work for some people. This might be enough of an excuse for some people to go digging. And like, for those of us who want to be really precious about these things, about Wardley Mapping, about Cynefin, about the ideal present, all that kind of stuff, like, we kind of have to give up that preciousness and be willing to try stuff like this to see if it creates enough starting energy or enough of an excuse for someone to go try it or go play with it and see if it's something that will help them. So I'm just going to like reply there. Experience extractors. Someone mentioned, well, I mean, it's in the papers that we described, right? Like the scientific model versus the mental model. Like, it's one thing for people to be able to describe their experiences in terms of a model, because then it can become externalizable, and then it can be shared, and then you can negotiate about that shared meaning to make sure that we really actually understand each other. This is like the world of hermeneutics or hermeneutical concerns. How to understand oneself and then make oneself understood. So experiences are huge. Oversight, priors, collective creation, process are the first words I can think of. I'm not quite sure. Presencing, being present, noticing has a lot to do with this, it seems. Design. This is one of the ones that I've liked to use. Like, Wardley Mapping is about designing systems, designing like from where you are right now, designing future compositions, designing moves, designing intent, designing strategy. But design is just like too much. Here's Venkatesh's response, which is just the best. Okay, getting the next ones queued up here, and we'll go through them. Ba, ba, ba. Okay. Emergent models. Failed the assignment because it used the word models. But emergence, like, deserves a little bit, like... Okay, all right, emergent models. That sounds like this new stuff. If I have the right word game, that sounds like calling it the new stuff. Thinking tools. You've heard that one. 2x2 envy. And here we go. Daniel calls it. These things are 2x2 envy. And this is actually funny because in Wardley Mapping, there's a comparison to a SWOT diagram, which a lot of folks use as a 2x2, and how the SWOT is ineffective for strategy, and Wardley Mapping is so much better. This is fun. And if you don't know Venkatesh is like the 2x2 king. So 2x2 envy. Fair enough. Situational awareness. Ah, that was another one I should have banned. But fine. That's another like novel set of words that like you would think might work, but it doesn't seem to be working. It's the words that we've been using for a while, and it hasn't connected in the way that it needs to connect. Intelligence amplifiers are catalysts. Where like intelligence is defined as the ability to forecast the future and then use that knowledge to act in the now to create greater optionality in order to create more well-being. So intelligence, like for realsies, not like smartness, but like intel. Analysis paralysis. This one like cracked me up because there's like a lot of good reasons, I think, to think of these things as like overkill. Someone else brings in rigor. Thinking constraints. Attenuation frames. Attenuation is an interesting word, but it definitely skews towards the like technical jargon. Like useful for me to like think about and ponder, but it's a little too much for most. Deliberately chosen biases, lenses to simplify complexity. Lenses to simplify complexity. There's the simplify complexity thing again, which we saw over in models, I think. Yeah, here it is. Mr. Landy, ways to use stickies. A fair criticism. Reductionism, technically true, at least for Wardley mapping. It's like we're doing reductionism in order to think, as compared to doing reductionism in order to stop thinking, I think, which is important. Analyzing competitive dynamics, that makes sense. Someone else said something about competitive stuff. Shibboleth. This is the other one that, like, it's kind of a snipe, right? But it's a justified snipe. Because especially if you have the connoisseur behavior, the kind of things where folks are really, like, focused on sounding smart rather than genuinely helping people move forward. Yeah, Daniel says, simplify complexity and abstraction. Strike me as the main cores of these clusters, or a main core. Yeah, yep. Yeah, so like, I'll let me note that down here, because I think so let's kind of put that at the root of it, because it does seem what people are trying to convey. The trick is, though, that like I'm not trying to necessarily find how we got here. It's really hard because I'm not exactly sure how to do this yet, but like I'm looking for the words people use that hint at simplifying complexity, or like hint at abstraction without saying it, so that it's readily apparent what it is that we're talking about. And it's one of those things where it's like I'll know it when I see it. There's a book by a guy named Bill Schley about oops, lost my mic. It's a book by Bill Schley. Something about microscripts is the title. I don't remember the full title, but the microscripts part is important. And it's like things that you hear people repeat. So if I say something and you say it back, and I didn't prompt you to do that, you say it on your own, that's interesting. It means it connected and it mattered as far as the language. So the reason that people will all like come back and like repeat things like the George Box quote, all models are wrong, some are useful. Like that's a good example of a microscript that has stuck in everybody's brain. And so I guess I'm looking for a microscript that describes this category of thing. And simplify complexity, like I think that is like justifiably like a thing that could be tested. It's just I've heard it before and it hasn't worked for people. But like I think actually I should include it and test it, because maybe I haven't done it with this intent. The other word that was used was cut through complexity. I think that was in either the nuance paper or the psychological models paper. Cut through complexity. Let me just catch up on the chat here. Yeah. Useful oversimplifications, definitely. Okay, we talked about shibboleths. Imaginative visualizations. Okay. Kind of put that over here with like the new stuff, emergent models. Ontology generation methods. Modeling by another name. Down here it's like ontology exploration. But again, it's using this extremely technical word, ontology. All right. Next batch here. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Info hazards. Whew. Dangerous knowledge. Yikes. So Kurt writes, Richard Feynman observed that complexity and jargon are often used to mask a lack of deep understanding. Yeah, and that's the hard part. Andrew Clay Schaefer has talked about developing your language, like learning to read and write and being able to speak clearly. In the way that he puts it is like speak with semantic density, or rather have semantically dense conversations. And like that is actually really important in order for us to be able to communicate. But there's like a moment before we build all that capability together, before we can have the semantically dense conversations, where we kind of have to like start from zero assumptions. And yeah, like definitely, I think going back to the connoisseurs in the nuance paper, that's hiding behind that is definitely part of this that we need to be worried about. Gosh, I have no idea what SCP means. I'm scared of all the things I don't know about. Complexity filters, complexity sieves, however you say that. I'm going to add that to the board just because you said it. Yeah, because in a way, like, models do that. It's like, too many things, overwhelm. Whew, these are the things that matter, these are the things that don't. Boom. Tools. Yep. Mindfulness, which, like, there's a version of mindfulness that's kind of like, ugh. And then there's, I think, the idea of being present and noticing stuff. And that's what I think of when I hear mindfulness. I don't know if that's the same word game that Joaquin is playing, but I imagine it might be. Mm-hmm. Some of the many ways of attempting to perceive/impose more coherent, consistent, usable/actionable order on what previously appeared unusably disordered. And my apologies to the Fluffbuster. I am going to abbreviate this because I think I need to in order to read it. Attempting to something order on what previously appeared unusably disordered. There's a lot of like words that could fit in there. Imposing order. Tools again, got me. Creative constraint forcing forms. Creative constraint forcing forms. Candies for nerds at heart. I love the sweet ones. Finding common language. Yep. Language is like so central to it all. And it's like, this is why, one of the reasons why visual conversation facilitators, why that fits or why it pings my brain a bit. Because like, if you can talk about it or like making things talk aboutable, something there, I don't know. Yeah, the unknown unknowns versus known unknowns. Who did Rumsfeld steal that from? Let's see. Yeah. There's some psychologists that nobody, Luft and Ingham, who developed the Johari window. I think that's what that's based on, which is wild. You forgot to forbid frameworks. Mother, got me. I know Daniel was on here. Oh, that's you. Yes. Got me. An important but largely missing consideration, subsequently overhyped into a new worldview. There's a lot there. Well, yeah. Mr. Snowden says a lot of things. Unimportant but largely missing. An important but largely missing consideration, subsequently overhyped into a new worldview. So, like Ben translation, a new set of check boxes. A new set of boxes to check. And then we hyped them up. That's a fair critique, honestly. And that's one of the reasons why I'm pretty like agnostic about a lot of frameworks or a lot of models or whatever. Like, they're all very useful in a certain context and all that fun stuff. I don't know. Being particularly like zealous about one just doesn't feel good. Doesn't make sense to me. Finding new ways to look at old things is important. It doesn't mean it's also the only way to look at all things. Yes, that's fair. Perfect. It's exactly how I feel. Tools for sorting things in our brain. Also, there's a Swedish word that you can say that describes that exact phrase. And I am not going to try to pronounce it, but perhaps I can convince something else to pronounce it for me. I wonder if I have OBS set up to pull in the sound. I think I do. So yeah, if you ever want to say tools for sorting things in our brains in Swedish, there you go. I just love like words that have dense meanings behind them. I mean, that's the lure, so the allure of this highly specific jargon language, right? It's like, oh, that meaning has density. We can go like into some really deep rabbit holes if we play with that word. Okay, Tim comes in with the kill shot. Draw a couple horizontal lines on them and they look awfully like any other X by X, for example, 3x3 matrix framework, to be honest. Oh, someone just punched me in the gut. And that's okay. Because, like, not wrong. And like, perception is actually probably more important. And that's the problem we're solving right now, is like the perception. What is that? Oh, it looks like a 2x2 that got dressed up. And is getting pushed by a bunch of people who want more followers on Twitter or something. Okay, let's get our next batch. Okay, there we go. There are probably quote tweets that I could dig into, but this will probably be the last batch here. Okay, thinking, question mark. Far too generic, but yes, that is exact. Yes, thinking. Perhaps even thinking together. Yes, you're right, Daniel. That's actually a good point. Daniel says X by X is also a member of this category, and I believe that to be true. That's why Venkatesh Rao gets so much value out of it, because it's like a way of slicing reality and interrogating it and then talking about it. It makes things discussable. Yeah. Jessica says paradigms. This feels kind of like the checkbox thing. Like, oh yes, we have a new paradigm to play with. Yay! Yep. Knowing what you're doing, common sense. It's dangerous. No, I'm just kidding. It's interesting, like, I'm not sure if common sense is, like, it's common sense to deploy these. Because if it's common sense to deploy these, then that seems untrue. Because we're fighting the problem of it not being common sense to deploy these. However, if Denise is saying that the bodies of knowledge hold common sense that could become common if we like explore it, maybe there's something there. Daniel says, all of these things create boxes and ask you to put things in them. You can arrange them however. It's all literal reductionism. You're not wrong. Now, there are some things that are like weirder, I think, than just figuring out what the things are and putting them into boxes. As much as I hate to be precious about stuff, like I think Knevin does do some weird things around how you are supposed to be, and it's not so much about like reverse engineering what kind of mode to operate in. It's more about noticing when you're in a mode. Like, oh, we are encountering complexity at this moment, therefore we need to like run some safe to fail experiments instead of trying to analyze our way out of it. I don't know. Maybe that's betraying how much I don't understand things, but what have you. I don't know. Complexity reducers is a nice word game in that way. Okay, yeah. It's making me think. And I think like this playing with complexity as like the center of the word is really interesting, because like you start to see how you could iterate through a lot of these different ideas of words. You could look reducer, simplifier, cuts through, visualizes, and like you can almost permutationally combine these terms in order to find something that fits the category question. Yeah, that's true, Daniel. It's like, well, yeah, not all these things are just reductionism, but you know, it is a foundation of all of them. Yeah, that's I think largely true. But you're right. Wardley mapping does at least draw lines between things. Right. Tools for navigating uncertainty. Fun fact, I used to own the domain name navigatinguncertainty.com. Because I thought I was going to do something with that. And then I gave it to someone. I think I gave it to, who did I give it to? Somebody in complexity world whose name starts with S, who I can't remember her name. I think it's S. Anyways. Situation and action comprehension aids. So like, to do like the breakdown thing, we could probably like look at the ways that people structure these words. Like someone used the like aids here, comprehension, situation, action. Like those things could be broken apart and permutationally combined. We could play with that a little bit. Okay. Marco cracked me up with humble heuristical helpers. That just makes me smile. It made me think of like little mental model buddies. Daniel says, reductionism is typically opposed to complexity in systems thinking, etc. So complexity reducer kind of plays with that, as well as being literally true in the sense of abstraction. Yeah, I've been, so the one thing that's attractive to me about that is actually like annoying the connoisseurs, the over-intellectualizers, the people who treat these frameworks as precious by taking the words they hold sacred and kind of stepping on them. And that's kind of like a way of, well, signaling to them what kind of behavior we're encouraging or discouraging, but also signaling to the people who are like just watching and curious. Oh, they don't care about that. So maybe, okay, maybe it's not such a big deal for me to try it. So it makes me, it tickles that part of my brain, that comment does. But yeah, also literally being what it's doing. Yes. I think finding a self-evident description is important. Like there's a version of category creation where you just say a word a whole bunch and hope that people start to repeat it back. And like one version of this that I'm doing right now is like, or not category creation, but with just generally with words. I'm using the phrase strategy for the self-taught deliberately, not because I think it's particularly good or amazing or anything, but because I want to see if people start saying it back to me. And then I'll switch it to something else later, but like that's just kind of the game that we're trying to play. Yeah. And the microscripts thing is like the memorability, the playback version of this. All right, here's another one, product management tool chains. That one's interesting because it's domain-based, product management. And tool chain is like a software development specific term. I was looking this up earlier, it's like the compiler and the linker are part of a tool chain. And so one might imagine a series of methods that you perform in order to do product management or whatever. Kurt says, microservices has entered the chat. Narrator says, it did not reduce the complexity. Thank you for that. Yeah. Oh, I mean, memes are part of the fun, honestly. Both the serious ones and the not so serious ones. Okay, we've got one that's like techniques. That kind of fits with thinking tools. Techniques. Techniques are defined as like ways of doing, right? So I kind of wanted to dig into this question a little bit more. It's like, well, if thinking is important and these help you think, how do we need to talk about them so people can position them easily in their minds? That's basically restating the whole premise for this stream. Consulting wear, my favorite. Ugh. Hope not. Swashbuckling. I have no idea what that means. If I Google this, am I going to get in trouble? Daring and romantic adventure. Bravado and flamboyance. Is there an Urban Dictionary version of this? I don't know. I just don't know. Oh yeah, microscripts. Hang tight. Let me grab the thing real quick, because I think it's like fascinating. And that's how he died, buried under a pile of books. It's over here somewhere. You would think I would like keep books in one place, like say the bookshelf. However, no. Okay. So the book is called The Microscript Rules: How to Tell Your Story and Differentiate Your Brand in a Sentence or Less by Bill Schley. And it's, I think the idea is that Bill did a bunch of work in traditional advertising, like think Mad Men. And like I am generally skeptical of that, but because it works for some sense of work, I want to understand it. So let me see, I have a couple highlights here. So he says, microscripts are about learning where the center is, finding it basically, and staying there. There's only one center. It is always simple, or it's not the center. It aligns everything that comes after it. It is energizing and exciting for anyone who finds it. Blah, 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 blah. This is their universal theory of everything, humbly named. And then the kind of big thing they always, like the one thing that I took away from this book was, it's not what people hear, it's what they repeat. So it's not what you say, it's what people hear. It's not what they hear, it's what they repeat. So that got me really curious, and it made me listen to people in a different way. And it's part of the reason why I asked the questions in these ways, so we could like go look at a bunch of the words that they use, because I want to know what words people have heard and are repeating. Because I think it's going to hint at what other words we could use that they might repeat as well. Let's see if there's anything else good in here that's highlighted. One of the other rules of this is like, tell stories so simple that they can literally work in about a sentence or less. They give a bunch of examples of brand things, like where there's smoke, there's fire is a microscript. Stop, drop, and roll is a microscript. Situational awareness is a microscript. The strategy cycle is a microscript. And it's like, for the people who use it, it taps into a whole bigger thing. It's not just a slogan. Kurt, you're right on. Yeah. So one of the examples used in the book is actually like in the United States, the political system, right? You've got Republicans using certain kinds of language and Democrats using different kinds of language. Well, actually Democrats tend to, like, at least the theory here is that they tend to use complex analyses to describe something, whereas Republicans just use sound bites. And because people hear the sound bites, they resonate and they can just repeat them, then they always have an answer. They can just say the sound bite. So it's exactly that. Yeah, they get into like, Daniel, they get into like kind of like the technical definition in here somewhere. I don't remember where it is, and I kind of don't care about it either, but like it could be useful to dig into about what, like a slogan versus a meme versus the microscript. Yeah. I don't know. So it's not like the gospel or anything, but they like talk about using it in mission statements and things like that. And so when I think about strategy deployment, by which I mean literally like if you think you have a strategy and you're about to like help the organization do it, you have to create initial conditions that basically not quite set and forget, but that create really, really good probability that things will play out in the way that you were, or at least in the direction that you were expecting them to play out. Like when people blame execution, I just think they've missed a lot of important things. And so like being able to communicate about the strategy and boil it down is actually super important. And I think this is a whole like skill set that some people learn and other people don't. And I think it makes a big difference. Yeah, of course, this is a good phrase. We all assume that corporate mission statements have to be a page long of happy talk and contain every fuzzy, happy-assed adjective ever invented by man. No wonder they get put away and never looked at. Yeah. So it's kind of like something to wake you up a little bit. Let's see, anything else in here? It's kind of fun too, because you see how they wrote a bunch of microscripts into the book. Like they kind of went meta, kind of like how in a pattern language, like there's a pattern language to the book, the pattern language. And a couple interesting, like one of the ones for Wardley Mapping that caught my eye is like when you start with a given, like a family name, When we already have an established corporate or family name like Oric or Halls or Johnson & Johnson, we can often attach descriptor words that become fused onto it. It's then said in the same breath, becoming part of our name. So they like give a couple examples, like Johnson Baby Shampoo. It's Johnson & Johnson Baby Shampoo, but like people attach the two things together. So like Wardley mapping is like, what's the thing that's said after that? Yeah. Just catching up on the chat here. Yeah, sharp and believable is part of it, I think. Like one of the things I think about is like not being able to forget something or not being able to like unsee it or unhear it. Like it's a permanent shift once you hear it. Not that it's transformative, just that it's like there's no going back. Like you can't unhear that. Creating better technologies the open source way. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little long, but if it can be said in a breath and other people are saying it back, that's what matters. Yeah, utterly forgettable. Okay, fair enough. There's your critique. Yeah, kind of like a jingle. Like but it needs to like tap into something bigger. It can't just be like a soundbite. It has to connect into the brand or something. I don't know. It's an interesting enough book to take a look at. It's called the Microscript Rules. Dangerously close to a book about marketing. Shoot, I think it's about marketing. Anyway, I found it interesting. Yeah. Oh, so I don't know what swashbuckling is. Categorizing. Kind of seems similar to tools for sorting things in our brains. Wikipedia pages seems pretty funny. Guilty. Yeah, and that's... I'll just check the quote tweets real quick, see if I missed anything. Thinking tools. Huh. This one talks about observability. Yeah, observability is the new shiny thing. Yeah, Kurt gives the example. Fill up on a tank of freedom. That was from a US gas commercial. Yep. If you're thinking it in your head right now, that's a perfect example of a microscript. And that's the tough thing is like it's kind of like power generally. It's like if only certain kinds of people cultivate power, that creates a problem, right? Like kind, compassionate, quiet people with no power, like that certainly will create a certain dynamic. So it's like for us, as we're looking at what we do, can we pay attention to what people are saying back to us when we talk about these tools and things like that? Craig says, is there a rough mapping between Cynefin and Wardley, chaos to Genesis, complex to Genesis, or custom, complicated to custom or product, obvious to product or utility? So the answer is no, although it's tempting to do. And the reason that I would say that is because, like, if you think about Cynefin, just for example, the difference between complicated and complex, right? How complicated the response is to first like analyze the thing, like take it apart, understand how it works, and then you get to an answer or one of many answers about what to do, right? Whereas in the complex space, you have to basically poke the system and see what happens and then try to basically ride the waves of like, this seems to be working for now, so let's keep doing it. So even just thinking about that complicated or complex question, there are complicated problems in Genesis and complex problems in Genesis. There are complicated problems in commodity and complex problems in commodity. So like there's like an ontological mismatch. That said, you know, for example, Dave says don't just use Cynefin as a categorization framework. Like if this, then that. But it's useful as a categorization framework. And if playing with just the overlap of like those phases in your head reminds you to do something in the right way, or like, I don't know, I'm more a fan of like you finding something that's useful to you than perfectly applying the model as the author intended. That said, people will get mad or upset about things if you say it's a thing and it's not actually the thing. So there isn't a mapping there, but it's a good question, and a lot of like people have asked that question, I think, on Twitter a bunch. Daniel says, sounds like compression is part of it. Yes, you're trying to take a vast amount of information and boiling it down into a very dense, evocative phrase. Yeah. Yeah, and Daniel's right. Like, Dave and Simon have had, like, conversations about it, and they've been fun and confusing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think there's some videos on Vimeo. Jabe, like, set them up to have a conversation once at Lean Agile Scotland, I think, which is interesting. So... Yep, Kurt, that's right. Lossy compression. Yeah, because you're discarding stuff. You're choosing not to bring it back. And that actually goes back to the comment about the landmine. If you hide stuff, which all models are hiding things by design, what you hide had better not be a landmine. Woo! So I'm tuckered. I'm tuckered out. To kind of recap what we did, I'm interested in how, like, what words I need to use in order to talk to people about Wardley mapping. Like, if Wardley mapping is about making models and asking it questions, if that's the fundamental thing that's happening here, and yes, there's like action at some point, but like, if this is the basic two-step thing, then we have a bunch of like obstacles about like how to describe it. And earlier we examined like the two generic words for what a Wardley map is, or what Wardley mapping is, or what Cynefin is, or whatever, is like a thinking tool, a sense-making tool. It's about decision-making. It's about strategy, like whatever. Like, people don't care about that. It doesn't connect. It doesn't mean anything. In fact, like as far as words go, these are words that are buckets that people have put a lot of meanings into. Yeah, so like already they're cursed. And then the other side of it is just like the over-intellectualized, jargony version of it, where it's like, oh, Cynefin is an ontological, epistemological framework. And people are like, all right, okay. For Wardley mapping, it's like the strategy cycle, purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, leadership. Yeah, isn't that fun? Have you heard about Uda? What about John Boyd? Like, what? Too much. So I want to make these things talk aboutable, but in order to do that, I have to find like the framing that people need, which I think is a new category of thing, and the words that people need to hear in order to like be open to that category of thing. And so we embarked on a process of discovery where we asked some questions like, what do models do? What is the category to which Wardley mapping, Cynefin, and the ideal present belong? And we haven't sorted through the data yet, but there's a lot of data. Just a lot of words to kind of play with and think about. Yeah. So what's next is an interesting question. I think I just had to sit down and do the analysis work on this. And I'm going to have to call it for tonight, but if I sit down and play with this a little bit, which the Miro board is in the back scroll if you're looking at the chat, you can take a look at that if you want to think about it for yourself. But the question that I would pose for us is just, we all know what it's like to talk to someone about this stuff, and for them to just like react by saying, oh, weird, all right, and move on with their day. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what could we do if we were able to find a way to speak to what these things do, so that we can like open up the conversation instead of immediately having it shut down? That's the challenge. And I'm not saying that we deserve this. Like, I'm not saying we deserve to have the conversations. I'm just saying, like, hey, if this is if these things are useful, if people do make different decisions when we do them, when we do Wardley Mapping, when we do Connevin, when we do the ideal present and all that stuff, I mean, wouldn't we want more of that to happen? So that's the challenge. Yeah, and Daniel, like, you're exactly right. It does depend on the person and their context and what they care about and what words they use. And that, I mean, if you want to go meta on Wardley Mapping, like, that sounds like a stage 2 kind of thing. It's like where you basically have to get a bunch of experts to map people to the words. And I think we're going to find a lot of different words that work for different people. But I'd like to have like 5 different phrases I could use and try and see what works. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both. Thank anyone else who watches this later for hanging out. If you want to talk about this at all, I'm available on the Twitters at Hired Thought. I think that's towards the bottom of the screen. And you can @ me, you can DM me and stuff like that if you ever want to talk about this stuff. The other thing you can do is you can email me. It's just ben@hiredthought.com. Always happy to talk about this stuff. If you have any questions about Wardley Mapping, or you need any help talking about how to bring it to a team, how to facilitate that conversation, I've got a lot of like little tricks up my sleeve that I've learned. And yeah, it's been fun hanging out with you. Thanks for being here. With that, farewell, have a lovely evening, and I hope the start to your week is excellent. Have an excellent Monday. Bye.